All right. Well, we're just about ready to get started, everyone. We're just kind of waiting for all the attendees to file in. But thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks, a special thanks before we get started to Carl Darby and Jordan Benchia from VIN Foundation, who put this together on some pretty short notice. But as you can see, we've got some great questions, and there's always a lot of confusion around student debt. And this one actually came from the Facebook group that Carl manages under the Microscope, it's called, and there was a pretty heated debate. And after receiving some of the same questions over the last few months about, what's the average number of student debt, and what are the good things to do and bad things to do, we figured we'd do a live presentation and kind of ask you guys some questions that we could cover and try to go through some of the common things that we see when it comes to student loans and repayment, and share some free resources that you can use to try to make better sense of all this. So again, thanks for joining. I think we're also live streaming this on Facebook through the VIN Foundation Facebook page, and the recording for this Zoom will also be available once we're done, so you can review it afterwards and even ask questions that we may not get to this evening. Carl, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, thanks everyone for showing up. This really came about, as Tony said, from hearing the same questions over and over again. Veterinary student debt seems to be a very confusing and difficult subject for a lot of people to get their heads around. And we're really fortunate tonight that we have Tony Bartels with us, who knows more about student debt than probably just about anybody. He's been a great resource for me personally, helped me with my son's student debt, and he's been a huge help for thousands of new graduate veterinarians around the country, helping them to manage their debt and see a clear way forward. And that's the important thing, is to have some guidance. That these are sometimes need individual attention for individual people's problems, but if we can do an overview and give everybody a rough idea about how this could work, we can hopefully get everybody on the right track. So I think the first thing I'd like to do is just talk for just a very short period of time about student debt itself. It seems a very confusing subject. Everybody has their own idea of what the average student debt is and student debt total is, and it seems very confusing. We're not always talking about the same thing, and it must be very confusing for a pre-vet student or even a veterinary student to really understand, how much debt they're going to be in. So if Tony, if you can kind of speak to that and answer the question, why is there so much confusion and conflicting numbers on the total student debt in veterinary medicine?
Yeah, so that is one that comes up quite frequently, and it really has to do with how we collect the data and present it. I think that we have just really started digging into the student debt data in a way where we're making better sense of it. We've collected it over the years. We've just collected it by surveying graduating veterinary students in their fourth year before they finish. Many of them don't even know where to find the number. And then there's also several folks who were leaving out, and we still kind of present that information in a way that just lumps everybody into the same bucket. And and if you follow any of the the income data in veterinary medicine, you'll know that we often present an average number to start, right? That might include those folks who are going into internships and residencies, but then we also break out those folks to say, well, how much are people making that are going into private clinical practice? Because that's more relevant than just lumping everybody together. Well, the same thing is true with student debt, and we're still kind of in the lumping everybody together stage, and that's that one number that everybody's looking for, right? But that I really discourage people away from that one number. It's kind of a trap, really, because you take everybody that's reported their student debt, you assume that what they've reported is actually correct, and we lump them all across whether they borrowed anything for student debt, and we include those who attend at an in-state residency rate, at a out-of-state residency rate, as well as only some of, actually very few of the folks who attend veterinary school in the foreign AVMA accredited schools like Ross or St. George's, St. Matthew's. I mean, the schools that, you can end up having higher debt, but we're not even actually asking a lot of those folks what their debt is when we calculate that, quote, one average number. So just to kind of give you the idea, and this is really what started this discussion over on Under the Microscope, is in the recent AVMA Economics Summit, the average number that was reported, so averaging everybody that reported it to us and the folks that we asked, was 143,111, right? And that includes folks who have zero debt and the few people from the Caribbean islands that actually did report it. And then also we broke out this year, the last 2 years we've actually broken out, well, what are the folks who attend just the Caribbean veterinary schools graduate with, and that's what the $260,000 number is, right? So now we have a couple of different numbers that float out there, and depending on, how detailed you are when you're reporting it, it can be quite confusing. The other part that is a little bit muddy is that, when AVMA started collecting this data for 2014 graduates in the new way, right? So when AVMA established their economics division and Mike Dix first started collecting data, they started with the 2014 graduating class. Right? So they index everything, and when they trend it against this 2014 graduating class. So the numbers that are actually reported here are a weighted number as opposed to the nominal number, which is the actual number of debt that you might be carrying, right? So the thing to really know here is that the debt is increasing, generally trending upwards at a rate that far outpaces what the incomes have been increasing at. Although in recent years we have seen a steady increase in incomes, but we've also now seen another increase in student debt. And this last little bit here is mostly because we're starting to now include some of the folks who are graduating from the foreign AVMA accredited schools. So that's a little bit of an overview of just some of the numbers that are out there for the 2018 graduates. Right, so really, when I get asked, what is the average student debt, I really have a hard time giving people just a single number. I have to give it more of a range. There is no single number that represents this issue because it's different for everybody. At the macro level, it may be statistically appropriate to calculate a single mean, but that really doesn't do justice to the folks who are trying to make sense out of their repayment options. Like we've already covered, the mean often includes those with zero debt. Again, might be statistically appropriate to do that, but if you don't have to borrow anything for veterinary school and you're reporting zero debt, it didn't cost you zero to go to vet school. It just means you didn't have to borrow any student loans. So for those of us who do have to borrow, it makes sense to break out those folks who do not have to borrow for veterinary school, and the data has started to do that. So we do have some numbers where they exclude those folks who have zero debt. I did cover that we average across all of the tuition statuses, right? So if you attend, say I went to Colorado State University as a resident, I have the opportunity to pay less than somebody who attended Colorado State as a non-resident, right? And that's different for folks who, say, go to Western University of Health Sciences, the veterinary program there. That's a private institution, and everybody gets charged the same rate. There is no in-state discount, right? So their cost profile is going to look very different than somebody who attends a state school at a resident rate. The AVMA accredited schools, the foreign AVMA accredited schools are starting to trickle in, right? But Ross graduates more than 400 students per year, and we're only capturing maybe 30% of those folks right now in this data. So that can have a huge impact on what those numbers will be once we start to include more of those folks. And we are surveying vet students when they're graduating, right? That's a hectic time of year. It's probably the last thing on their list is to answer these survey questions and then go look up what their actual student debt data might be. But in my experience, once I start to see their student debt data, it's often inaccurate, right? So they're either counting just the amount that they borrowed and excluding the interest, or they're just putting out an average number of what they think their student debt's going to be, and they don't really know what the number is until they actually get into repayment. That's a pretty common situation, right? So I think we have to get a little bit better at trying to find some more concrete numbers than just asking them to say, hey, what do you think your student debt is the April before you graduate. So some of the stuff I'm excited about. So this year, this is the first the AVMA economic reports that come out every year. This is for the 2017 graduates. We don't have this for 2018 graduates yet, but this is a new way of presenting this information. This is the first year that we've presented it this way, and you can see, you know, when we present this range of $150,000 all the way up past $250,000, you know, who's right, who's wrong. Everybody's right. Right, so it really depends on where you went to school, you know, what your cost profile would have been, right? So if you went to a resident public veterinary institution, your mean and median is a much lower than if you went to a Caribbean veterinary school where you don't have the opportunity for that in-state discount, right? And your borrowing costs are actually higher. So this is one of the reasons why we have such a wide range of student debt data that's reported, and we have such big discrepancies in the numbers that are presented. If you guys do have any additional questions during the webinar on these topics, you can ask them in the question section of the Zoom. And we are also monitoring the Facebook feed as well. So if you have some additional questions on that come up, please feel free to type them in, and we'll do our best to answer them as we see them.
Yeah, Zachary did make a comment that, you know, his numbers are not the average, and I think that's what we tend to see. And it causes a lot of confusion and you know, a little bit of anxiety when the number that you have doesn't even closely match, you know, the figures coming out of places like AVMA. And I think it's good to understand that it's very complex, and that's why, you know, sometimes you do need to have an individual approach to managing your debt, because you may be in a completely different situation than somebody from a different school.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great comment. You know, and that's one of the reasons why we've been so vocal about breaking this data out in various ways, because we do a disservice to those folks who, you know, they did the best they could to keep their borrowing costs down. But if you attend, you know, Virginia, Maryland as a non-resident, you really don't have an opportunity to borrow the quote average that AVMA is reporting, right? So that makes you feel like you did something wrong. In reality, you didn't. You know, you did the best you could based on the situation that you had. And I think that's what we're really trying to present, is that, you know, the story is different for everybody depending on how you got to and through veterinary school. None of them are right, none of them are wrong, they just are, right? And they're all going to have different ways for managing them going forward, but we want to start from the point of, hey, you know, you did the best you could, this is what the numbers are, let's look at what we can do next. So that brings me to the debt to income ratio, right? So that, you know, we tend to get almost, you know, hyper focused on just what's the debt number, right? But the debt is really only an issue if we don't consider what the income is, right? Because, you know, you take on all this debt presuming that we're going to earn enough to be able to service it. So that's really what causes the quote crisis when we talk about veterinary student debt, or just the student debt that we see for higher education today across the U.S., right? So, but this is what it looks like for veterinary medicine, right? And I think this does a much better job than presenting that quote mean debt number, right? It shows you the entire range. So we have those folks that are reporting zero debt, right, included in here, and that's about 17% of the graduates who are reporting their information to us. But then we have this spectrum that extends all the way out, and we have numbers, we have blips here that are past that $495,000 range. Right, so all of that gets, I mean, you can be anywhere and everywhere along this reported debt curve, right? And the fact remains, you know, the income curves are pretty tightly concentrated around a couple of points, right? So that's $75,000, $80,000 for the 2017 graduating class, and then we also have those folks who went and did internships and residencies around that $30,000 mark, right? The fact that these income peaks are so far left on this graph, they don't match up well with those traditional repayment options that we tend to be told to use quite frequently, right? And that can be another source of stress, right? So then we have to figure out, well, how do I make the numbers work? Because often if we try to use those traditional repayment plans under situations like this, the minimum monthly payment can exceed what we're actually earning.
Yeah, and I think this graph really highlights the you know, the struggle that some new graduates have, and I think a lot of times it's hard for, you know, older veterinarians and practice owners to really understand. You know, it's easy to say, well, you know, it's their own fault for going into too much debt, but when we see a graph like this, we really do see, you know, that there is a significant problem here, and you know, it does need to be addressed. If you're to the right of that curve, you know, of that graph, you're going to have some significant problems based on the income that's the standard income for veterinary medicine. The good news is, you know, we do have some solutions, which is the purpose of tonight's talk. But I think this graph, more than anything, really shows what the problem is, to me, more clearly than anything else.
Yeah, and then what we can do, and what the AVMA has done, which is also helpful, is to take the folks who reported their student debt, and then also what they reported their incomes to be, and they generated a debt to income ratio, right? And this is extremely useful. We can start to use these numbers as a baseline for making decisions. So generally speaking, those, you know, the experts, whoever the financial experts are, tell you not to incur more student debt than you're going to earn once you graduate from that program, right? Which, you know, is laughable when we look at that in the context of veterinary medicine, right? So we can see here, just from the folks who are reporting in 2017, 77% of them have a debt to income ratio above 1. Right, and traditional repayment plans, that's where that works, is where debt to income ratio is 1 or less. That's what favors paying your student debt back as fast as possible using a standard 10-year plan, or maybe extending it out a few years beyond that. That's when that works really well. But when we're above that 1, and particularly when we're above that 2, as more than half of the folks who reported in 2017 are, that presents some real challenges. And that's where the traditional repayment plans fall apart on us. But thankfully, we do have some additional solutions that we're going to illustrate tonight. So just to you know, take it back, you know, we started kind of at the macro, and now, you know, dive in a little bit more at the micro level. What the economics team has started to do over at AVMA is also report this information per school, right? So now we can start to get a better idea, not only, you know, where do the schools fall in relation to the mean, but it also gives you an idea, if you're in school or considering one of these schools, how much might I graduate with, or you can measure yourself up against the mean for that school. Right, so that's a part where you might actually be able to try to, you know, gauge where you may belong in this particular spectrum. But again, all of these schools even still lump everybody together, right? So, and that's why we see these huge standard deviations. So just Michigan State as an example, the mean 175,441 plus or minus 103,000. Right? That's a huge range. So, you know, it would be helpful if we actually broke these out by residency status in that regard to make it even more useful. When we do look at a school like Western, right, so everybody pays that private rate, the mean is quite a bit higher, right? So when the mean is 150,000, the nominal mean for everybody that reported, and then you have a school like Western where the mean is 273,000 plus or minus 131, right? That's going to look a lot different than, you know, folks who graduated with maybe $150,000 of student debt. So that's kind of the big picture of the why are there so many numbers, right? So there's a lot of schools, there's a lot of different cost probabilities and possibilities depending on where you fall in that spectrum, and what your borrowing needs might have been is really going to determine what your average is, right? And that's really, when it comes down to repayment, that's the only thing that matters.
Okay, great. I think that's a great overview. So we're now at the situation where we're maybe towards the right-hand side of that graph, and we've got a debt-to-income ratio of over 2. So what are our choices here? I mean, do we eat ramen noodles for the next 20 years? Do we go work for the government with public service loan forgiveness? Is there some middle ground? Is there some way we can have a good veterinary career and not be crushed by the high debt burden we have?
Yeah, and that was I think one of the questions that came through the Facebook group was you know, is there a middle ground between eating ramen noodles for the next 20 years and working for the government? And we're actually going to cover that, and that's really where these income-driven repayment plans come in, right? So this is kind of a new experiment when it comes to ways for repaying an education. So traditionally, and probably your parents, your veterinary school mentors, those folks who graduated before 2000, they didn't really even have access to making payments on their student loans based on their income. They really had to lean on those standard 10-year plans, graduated and extended repayment plans, which are still really traditional repayment plans. And of course, private loan refinance, which is still a traditional way of repaying your loans. It's just based more on your credit score and your income, and your ability to negotiate, really. So there's all these different options, but how do we compare them against each other? And then how do we know which one we can use, right? And this is where I kind of lump a lot of what we're going to cover here into, first, which plans can I use, which is an extremely difficult thing to even know. Based on when you started borrowing, the types of student loans that you took out during school, in undergrad, and maybe before you went to vet school, and definitely during vet school, all of that's going to determine which repayment options you even have available. And then once you narrow those down, you have to pick one, right? One, or maybe you even need to use more than one depending on your loan portfolio. So which plan or plans should you use after that? Right, so this is what and one of the resources that we're going to highlight tonight, because we've all struggled with this. And I graduated in 2012. My wife's a veterinarian as well. We have debt in excess of $400,000, right? And paying under a traditional repayment plan, as much as our family and everybody else told us to do so, was not financially feasible, right? So we were left with wondering, well, what's next? So we started diving into the alternatives, and we stumbled on these income-driven repayment options through a number of years of research with Paul Payan and VIN Foundation. We've come up with the Student Debt Center, right? So all of the information that we've learned, all of the cases and experiences that we've gathered from the veterinary community, we've built into the Student Debt Center, where you can actually start to measure up some of these options, right? I want to visit or just show you the Student Debt Center here, right? So this is freely available. You don't have to be a VIN member to use this, right? So this is publicly available. Anybody can use this. It's designed with veterinarians in mind, but you can certainly use it if you're not. But it is designed first and foremost for veterinarians. We've got a number of tools here that we're going to go through, and the which plans can I use? This is actually a relatively new feature that's been added to the Student Debt Center. I spent probably the first 5 years I was doing this digging into people's student loan statements and National Student Loan Data System files, trying to figure out which repayment qualifications they met or didn't meet, right? So instead of doing that all manually now, you can upload what your NSLDS files. NSLDS.ed.gov is kind of your official federal student borrowing history with the government, right? So you can download that file and you can actually upload it into this function in the Student Debt Center, and it will show you what your options are, right? I'm going to do one of these here just to kind of set the stage for this. This particular one, so that's an NSLDS file that somebody sent to me, but you can go out to NSLDS.ed.gov, download that file, and then you can put it into here, right? And that's the most consistent place that the information is available. Your loan servicers are a mess, right? I'm sure you all know that. I don't have to tell you that, but they all present these things differently, and they call your loan something different. But in that NSLDS system, everything is for the most part consistent. This is probably one of the more complex ones I've ever worked with. But this income-driven repayment eligibility tab will show you how much of your balance qualifies for the various repayment options that are available, right? At least from the income-driven repayment plan standpoint. So right here, we see that we can learn some valuable information in terms of, not all of my balance seems to qualify for all of these plans. Is there something that I might be able to do in order to make more of it qualify for some of these plans that are more on the right side of the spectrum, because those are usually more beneficial. But we're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail here. So let's get to this middle ground. So what is the middle ground for paying off outrageous student debt between Ramen Noodles and indentured servitude with the federal government, right? So we've already alluded to this, but if your debt to income ratio is greater than 1, you might consider paying based on your income. The income-driven repayment options, as the name implies, they are based on a percentage of your income. And the newer iterations of those plans, so pay as you earn and revised pay as you earn, can get you down to about 10% of your discretionary income. And discretionary income is a specific measure used by the Department of Education, but it generally tracks your taxable income, and it will be somewhere around 10% of that number, right? So that can be a relief for many folks, particularly those with veterinary school-sized student loan portfolios, making those payments a lot more affordable. If your debt to income ratio is greater than 2, then you're definitely going to want to lean on these income-driven repayment options. Not only are they going to give you a lower payment, they're probably going to be the least expensive options available to you, right? So you don't have to eat ramen noodles for the next 20 years. And if you want to work for the government, you can, right? And there are certain benefits to that, one of them being public service loan forgiveness, right, which also involves using one of these income-driven repayment plans, right? So there's a lot of overlap in the federal student loan system in terms of the things that you need to do in order to benefit from not only the income-driven repayment plans, but also public service loan forgiveness if you do work for the federal government. And I don't know that I call it indentured servitude in this, it depends, right? So, I mean, if you're kind of, some people are just government inclined, nonprofit inclined. I mean, if that's you, there's a lot of opportunities, particularly in veterinary medicine, to do those sorts of things. And why not take advantage of something like public service loan forgiveness if you find yourself in one of those careers, right? But for some folks, if they're really stressed by their student debt, that is an option, right? So 10 years, public service loan forgiveness is actually 10 years that you make payments based on your income. And if you satisfy all the requirements, then your remaining balance would be forgiven and you don't have to pay tax on that. In the context of income-driven repayment, if you pay, say, using pay as you earn, which is a 20-year maximum repayment period, if you have anything left at the end, you would have to pay tax on that, right? So in that context, 20 years applies to pay as you earn, 25 years for repay and IBR, and anything that's left at the end would be forgiven and treated as taxable income. And we'll cover that in one of the other questions. But you can use the VIN Foundation Student Loan Repayment Simulator to start to match up some of the costs around these repayment options. And you'll start to see, particularly in those debt to income ratios where it's 2 to 1 or higher, that they're actually quite cost beneficial. So when I look at my total debt load, including credit cards and debt other than student loans, should I focus on paying my student loan balance down first or last? So this is one I see come up quite a bit, particularly with new grads, because that student loan balance is so large, right? They cannot get their head around the fact that, well, that number is really big. I should put as much money as I possibly can towards that really big number to make it a smaller number. And, logically that may make sense. However, student debt is not like your other debt, right? And this is where we can start to get into some of the real controversial areas when it comes to student loan repayment. Generally speaking, credit card debt, medical debt, other kinds of student debt, auto loans, things like that, yes, the faster you can pay those down, the less expensive they're going to be and the better off you're going to be. Your student debt does not fall into that category, right? So it is extremely flexible. You have a lot of insurance baked into those federal student loans that you have from veterinary school or beyond. And you should take advantage of those, particularly if you have other kinds of debt, right? So if you have credit card debt, that should never take a back seat to your student loans, right? So you're going to want to focus on paying down that credit card debt first and foremost. I would use income-driven repayment to reduce my payment as low as I can based on my income, so I have more money to pay that credit card debt even faster. Private loans, I would throw in that same category. Private loans are not very flexible. They're usually based on, a term, right? So maybe you have 10 years from the time you graduated. The balance that you took that loan out at and the interest rate that you have is going to determine the minimum monthly payment. Those private student loans don't care if you're making income or not, right? So the faster you can get rid of those, the more flexible your budget's going to be, and you can start to focus on other items. And then if you have other higher interest rate debt, this comes up. I mean, I see folks with medical debt frequently, or they're helping their family with other sources of debt that they may have. They've got a really unfavorable auto loan or something like that. Those are also opportunities to leverage the income-driven repayment plans. Have your payment based on your income, 10% of your income, and then you'll have more money to get rid of some of that less flexible debt more quickly. So I would say student debt, in my mind, is almost always at the back seat of anything that I owe because it's so flexible, right? And I have the option to reduce that payment to my income, or if I fall on hard times and I lose my job, or my income, or my wife loses her job for some reason, or goes on maternity leave or something, and her income decreases, I can have that payment on that big chunk of student debt that I'm carrying lowered based on our new income situation, right? So that's extremely flexible.
Just a comment from a viewer saying that the government work public service loan forgiveness program is not readily available for a lot of people. She said she has a list of people looking for jobs and there aren't too many available. So that may be a limited option anyway for a lot of new graduate veterinarians.
Yeah, and that can be the case when you're talking about government jobs specifically, but public service loan forgiveness applies to more than just government positions. So it's any 501c3 nonprofit charity organization, right? So that covers a lot of ground in veterinary medicine. Almost all of the shelters are 501c3 nonprofits. Zoos, aquariums can be 501c3 nonprofits. All of the veterinary schools are, right? So there is a huge amount of opportunity outside of just the government realm where you can actually qualify for public service loan forgiveness. So don't overlook those opportunities as well.
What would happen in that situation if you're in, say, a shelter situation and you leave the position for whatever reason to do something else that's no longer considered a loan forgiveness job?
Yeah, so you don't have to do it 10 consecutive years. So if you found yourself maybe you were working for a shelter for 5 years and then you're in a private practice for 3 years and you decided that, your real love was back in the shelter realm and go back, you can still do that. And, once you meet that 120 months, that 10 years of qualifying, quote, public service, then you can be eligible to apply to have your loans forgiven tax-free, right? So in that instance, it may take you 13 years to qualify for forgiveness, but you would still be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. It doesn't have to be consecutive. You would, however, that is a good segue into this, you would, however, if you're using something like pay-as-you-earn during that period, you would have to qualify for public service loan forgiveness before you reach the maximum repayment period under pay-as-you-earn. Right. So and we had a really good question come in from the Facebook group about what happens at the end of income-driven repayment. And so what is the end, right? And depending on the plan that you're using really determines the end. So these plans are really based on what are called these maximum repayment periods, right? So pay-as-you-earn, the new version of IBR, you only get 20 years to pay based on your income. And you'll either pay your balance to zero during that 20 years, or if you reach that maximum repayment period, that's when it triggers forgiveness or cancellation of the remaining balance. But in that case, it's treated as taxable income, right? In IBR, the older version, and in revised pay-as-you-earn, you have 25 years, so you have a little bit longer time. Sometimes that can be beneficial, but generally speaking, the longer you spend in repayment, the more you're going to pay. So there's pros and cons to each of those. The follow-up to that, and the obvious follow-up to that, is how does student loan forgiveness work? So once you hit these maximum repayment periods, if you have anything left, you would have it canceled. So you'll get what's a 1099-C in the mail. So every year you get a W-2 that shows kind of your earnings. If you went to the casino and won $100,000 on the roulette tables, you'd get a 1099-G that says, hey, you have to report this $100,000 to the IRS. You didn't pay tax on it. You're going to have to pay tax on that at the end of the year. Same with this, right? So you're going to pay, and let's say you had $100,000 of your balance left at the 20-year point, that's going to be canceled. You're going to get a 1099-C in the mail that year, and you're going to have to pay the tax on that forgiveness when you file your taxes for that tax year, right? So that's logistically how forgiveness is set up to work, unless, of course, you qualify for public service loan forgiveness. That there is no tax associated with that. So you would apply to have your student debt forgiven tax-free, and if you met all of the qualifications for that, your debt disappears. You don't have to report that as income to the IRS, and you're partying after that. Will be taxed at your, so if you do experience the taxable form of forgiveness, it'll be taxed at your marginal income tax rate, right? So it's going to take into account all of the other sources of income that you have for that year, add that on top of it, and that's what's going to generate your tax for that amount that's forgiven. And that's where we can get into some academic exercises about what might my tax be on that amount that's forgiven 20 or 25 years from now. Generally speaking, you know, the top marginal tax rate right now is 37%, right? So you're not going to pay any more than 37%, presuming that the tax rates stay where they are now. And in all likelihood, it's going to be something much less than that, because that 37% tax bracket doesn't start until something like $600,000 and above for folks who are filing jointly. So the chances that you're going to be taxed at a rate that's, you know, much higher than 30% on what's forgiven on your student loans is probably pretty low, unless we have some major change to how we tax folks at the federal level. You do also have to take into account state income taxes. So if you live in a state like California, New Jersey, Illinois that have high income taxes, you're going to have to allocate a little bit more for your potential tax due on forgiveness. But if you live in one of those great non-income tax states like Wyoming, Texas, Florida, I think falls into there, those are places where you don't pay state income taxes, right? So you wouldn't have any tax at the state level on your student loan forgiveness. Student Debt Center is really going to help you with this, right? So this, I'm going to go back to the where we are in the Student Debt Center for that, just to illustrate this, right? So I'm going to use once you upload your information into the My Student Loans tool, you can send this information over to the simulator, right? So we'll take that information, we'll populate it for you. I know that this person has been using the income-based repayment plan for a few years, right? So we can take into account the time you've already spent in income-driven repayment. And I believe this person wanted to investigate a switch from IBR to revised pay-as-you-earn, which is quite common. This is where this becomes a little bit art and science, you know. So if you know your current income, great. I mean, you should know your current income, but the future income is going to be a little bit more difficult to predict. So here we give you some tools. You can either estimate that income at a straight line increase at whatever percentage that you think is appropriate, or you can change them at your heart's content based on what your situation might be. We also have the ability to take into account your family situation, right? So whether you're married now or will be in the future, we can add things like that into the simulation, because that will affect your ultimate monthly payment in income-driven repayment. So let's say that this person is getting married in a couple of years. Spouse's salary might be, let's say, I don't know, $75,000. Let's leave the debt out of it for the time being for the spouse. And then here you can start to get an idea of whether or not how you should file your taxes, at least from a student loan standpoint, right? We're not going to make any kind of presumptions about what it's going to cost you to file your taxes jointly or separately at a tax level, but we can show you the impact of what that tax filing status will be on your student loans. Kids will also play into this, right? Whether you have them now or you're planning to have them in the future, right? That's also going to impact your student loan repayment costs. And I'll show you how that looks in a second. So we put all that information in, we run a simulation, and we can start to measure up these repayment plans. So this person started in income-based repayment, right, with a fairly high number. Interest rate is 6.7%. You can see that the payment due under IBR at that income level of $85,000 is $750 a month versus, you know, look at what it is under traditional repayment plans, right? If you want to pay that off, quote, as fast as possible, $5,000. I mean, that's just about how much you're going to be taking home, probably more than what you're going to be taking home at $85,000 a year, right? So that's really not even doable. A standard 25-year plan, not much more help in that regard. I mean, we're talking about multiples of cost savings per month that gives you more money to work with on a monthly basis. But then you also have to plan for this ugly forgiveness thing, right? So in this case, this person is going to have something like $560,000 forgiven, depending on the repayment plan that they use. If we estimate a tax rate of 30%, this is how much we're going to need to have on hand to cover that 22 years from now. Excuse me. So here, this is where you can start to play with this a little bit more. So maybe you think the 30% is too low. Fine, you can update it. 35%. Maybe that's going to be a little bit higher. I also now need to allocate maybe $500 a month or so in order to have enough on hand to cover that tax due on forgiveness. And that then brings up the question, well, what do I do with that money, right? So in here, we assume a pretty conservative savings rate, 3%. You can change that if you want to be more aggressive, and then it will lower how much you need to save, right? But in this case, $754 a month plus the $400 a month is $1,100 a month to cover your student loan payment, still way lower than anything that you're going to get under a traditional repayment plan or a private refinance, right? So this is where this is a game changer. You know, the numbers still look big, but they are still numbers, and they do become more manageable as we start to break it down in this manner. And like I said, this is quite a high starting balance. You know, the higher your starting balance, the more you're going to have forgiven generally, but it also depends on how much you're earning over that time period as well. Give me one.
Can we just answer a couple of questions, Tony, before we move on?
Yeah, absolutely. Give me a chance to drink something too. My throat's a little on fire.
So somebody asked if you started getting the student loan debt after 2014, the maximum repayment period is 20 years. Is that correct?
So that brings up the difference between the new version of IBR and the old version of IBR. So let me see how I want to talk about this. So if the first loan that you took is after July 1st, 2014, you would qualify for the new version of income-based repayment. So income-based repayment started in 2009. It changed by law again in 2014, and I believe that's what the question is referring to. However, those folks who also qualify for the new version of IBR would also qualify to use pay-as-you-earn. And pay-as-you-earn and the new version of IBR are very similar, but you should always choose pay-as-you-earn, right? You shouldn't use the new version of IBR. So pay-as-you-earn is going to be the one that you're going to focus on in that case. It's going to be 20% of your, or I'm sorry, it's going to be 10% of your discretionary income for 20 years maximum repayment period, and pay-as-you-earn comes with a cap on the amount of interest that can be capitalized if that should happen. And that's going to go way beyond what we're going to cover in this particular session. But just know that pay-as-you-earn has an additional insurance provision in it that protects your starting balance from growing more so than the new version of IBR. So in that regard, pay-as-you-earn is always better than the new version of IBR. And if you qualify for the new version of IBR, you should also qualify for pay-as-you-earn. So choose pay-as-you-earn, right? And make sure you check that box on the application, because your loan servicer might try to put you in a different plan, right? So choose pay-as-you-earn and do it because it's going to be a better repayment plan than the new version of IBR. For the folks who don't qualify for that new version of IBR, you still might qualify for pay-as-you-earn, and you always have the option of the older version of IBR. However, the older version of IBR is 15% of your discretionary income for 25 years. Usually not as beneficial, but in certain cases it can be.
Okay. If you get your loans forgiven by public service loan forgiveness, is it also tax-free at a state level?
Yes, it is also tax-free to state level. So public service loan forgiveness, I'm gonna do that here just to show you what it looks like. So public service loan forgiveness is kind of like the holy grail, right? I mean, there is no less expensive way to get out of your student debt. And in this case, you can see if this person, and I believe this person is doing a master's and a PhD program and is probably going to stay in the academic system, $465,000 of student debt, paying based on their income for 10 years, they would have more than $500,000 of student loans forgiven and not have to pay tax on it. You wouldn't have to pay tax on it at a state level or a federal level. So yeah, I mean, that's a I mean, that's a heck of a deal if you can get it, right? So it really, if you're heading that direction anyway, make sure you're doing all the right things to qualify for public service loan forgiveness. Even if you're not heading that direction and you want to consider it and that opportunity is available, it's hard to ignore numbers like that, right? So yeah, that can be an extremely beneficial plan for a lot of folks.
So somebody else asked, should I not contribute to a 401k or IRA account until my student loan debt is paid or forgiven? And I think we've already kind of hinting that putting all your money into loan repayments not a good strategy. So
yeah. I will add to that, because I do see that question come up, and I do see some folks leaving. 401ks are extremely beneficial, right? The money that you put into a 401k, you don't have to pay tax on, right? So you're already receiving a tax benefit. The growth that it experiences over hopefully decades before you reach retirement, none of that gets taxed, and it also lowers your taxable income. And I told you that income-driven repayment is based on your taxable income. So if you lower your taxable income by saving for retirement in something like a 401k plan, you will lower the minimum monthly payment that you have for your student loans. That's generally going to save you more money over the long run. It's also going to give you more money in your budget to work with, and it incentivizes you to save for retirement, right? So you have a retirement nest egg that you're building over the next several decades. The second part of that is a lot of 401ks offer a match. That is literally free money, right? I mean, there is no other source of free money out there than those employer matches in 401ks, right? So if you're leaving that on the table, stop, right? Contribute at least the amount that you need to maximize that employer contribution so you get access to that free money. And then you'll also have the opportunity for that money to grow over time. And that growth is compound growth, right? So you're adding money to it. It's growing at maybe 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 12% per year. And then that gets added to the amount that generates more of a return. All of that is compound growth. Your student debt is not compounding, right? So everybody, that's one of the more common misconceptions of student debt is that, I have to pay this student debt. It's at 7% interest and it's compounding. It's not compounding. It's simple interest. And when you're in income-driven repayment, that interest that you might not even be covering on your payment doesn't accrue any more interest. It just accrues by itself in an unpaid interest bucket that doesn't get charged interest on itself, right? So there is a half a dozen incentives there to make sure that you are maximizing your retirement contributions while using something like income-driven repayment. It's going to make your financial plan much more robust.
Excellent. And the one final question, I think, hopefully we've already kind of answered that if your IBR payment doesn't cover the monthly interest, are there other options, or do we just drown and make no impact on our loans? And I think you've shown that with the loan simulator that that's not actually the case because of the forgiveness after 20 years. And in some cases, as you showed in your example, it's impossible to make a significant dent in your loan balance because the monthly payment to pay off principal interest is just more than you're making.
Right.
So,
yeah, and I want to, I'm going to show you guys a graph here, and just to graphically represent this. So, and this is the case here. So, income-driven repayment, oftentimes you have a payment that is below the amount of interest that you accumulate, right? So this blue line here is the interest. $2,500, $2,600 of interest, the payment is $754, right? So you're nowhere near that. So your principal balance in this case never changes, right? Your principal balance stays the same, right? But the amount that you're not covering with your payment each month is just added to this unpaid interest bucket. And that's what this lighter orange color is on top of that graph. So that unpaid interest is not accumulating interest on its own. So yes, as hard as it is to watch, your loan balance often will grow. And in this case here, so I took the public service loan forgiveness option off. In this case here, she will have a higher balance forgiven than she started with, right? So she started with 464 through the monthly payments, ended up with $102,000 of unpaid interest. Those two things added together is what gets canceled, forgiven, and that's what you pay taxes on, right? So that is a very real possibility. But financially speaking, it doesn't make sense to try to knock down that unpaid interest balance. You're only going to increase your repayment costs because you're probably still going to have something forgiven at the end, right? So better to pay the minimum and then plan for the forgiveness using your forgiveness planning module to help you target what that number is going to be.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people that seems counterintuitive, and especially if you talk to financial advisors or even your parents, you know, the idea that you're paying less is a better way to go just doesn't seem right. But the numbers don't lie.
Right.
And I think that the power of the loan repayment simulator is just showing you how you can make those plans really work for you, and still have some disposable income to save for your retirement, you know, rather than trying to meet an impossible goal of servicing a debt that you're just not making enough money to service. You know, it's a hard thing to get your head around.
Absolutely, and one of the side effects of this, right? This is not something that we expected to see coming into this, but it's just not how the numbers play out. So let's pretend that this income-based repayment plan plays out the way that we've simulated it for this person, and you see that your total repayment costs over the next 22 years in this case are a little over $700,000 on a $465,000 balance. If you were to try to pay that off faster, right, under something like a standard 10-year plan, you would actually end up paying more in some cases, right? In this one, that's not the case, at least as we compare it to IBR. But when we compare it against something like pay-as-you-earn or revised pay-as-you-earn, it's actually less to pay based on your income and save for the forgiveness than it is to try to punish yourself for 10 years and get rid of the debt faster, right? So that's where not only are you punishing yourself financially, you're actually paying more than you probably have to. I mean, that is certainly the case if we look at it on an extended plan, right? So that's one of the eye-opening things here, is that not only is there, you know, tax incentives and financial plan incentives to leverage the income-driven repayment plans, they're often less expensive in the long run, right? And that's really counterintuitive. So, you know, you have to run some simulations for your own situation to wrap your head around that. But I see that quite frequently with the veterinary situations that I help with. All right, so let's and then I definitely I end up telling people that there's all these great benefits and it can save them money, and then their next question is, well, what happens if the government changes the rules while I'm repaying? Or maybe I'm 19 years in repayment, and in the 19th year before I experience forgiveness, the government decides they want to change the rules, and I'm left now with more debt than I started with, and I listened to you, and you're a jerk, and you ruined my life, right? I mean, that is a common concern that folks have. But you really have to dig into the contracts that you signed, right? So these master promissory notes, they're public information. Theoretically, you should have reviewed them all, right? When you take the student debt, they make you check the box that you read it, just like, when you log into Apple, the iTunes agreement. So I'm sure everybody has read their master promissory note. I'm just joking, but you can look at that. All of these plans are baked into there, and they're contractually obligated to honor those. One of the other things that we've seen in the recent years from all of the groups that want to change this or find this to be way too financially beneficial for some folks and not others, and that it's going to bankrupt the country or whatever the talking point is, all of the new proposals set up a system for new borrowers. Right, so nobody is proposing a change that would alter the repayment plans as they exist for the folks who have already borrowed or who are already in repayment. Right, so that is another, even the Prosper Act, which was the closest thing we had to reauthorizing the Higher Education Act in a long time, detailed out a new program for folks who were borrowing in the future. Right, so they were going to just basically wind down all of the folks who have already borrowed under the previous rules, and then the folks who are borrowing in the future would have a different repayment landscape with different options available. Maybe not the same options, right? That's what they're talking about changing. But the folks who are in repayment and already borrowed would have the same protections and the same contracts available to them. One of the other things that has happened this past year that this Congress passed was a temporary expansion of public service loan forgiveness. So I don't know if any of you have followed the news about how terrible it was that less than 1% of the people who applied for public service loan forgiveness didn't actually qualify for it. And there's some real specific reasons for that, and most of it is because it was extremely difficult to know if you were doing the right things in order to qualify, but it has become much easier to do so. But that first round of folks who went through this application process really had no information available to them. Their loan servicers were no help. So Congress actually expanded public service loan forgiveness to help those folks who technically didn't follow the rules or were given bad information. So $3.5 million was allocated to expand the opportunity for folks who didn't quite follow the rules to now qualify for public service loan forgiveness. And if we can get something like that passed in this current Congress, I don't think it's likely that public service loan forgiveness is just going to get wholesale eliminated for folks who are already in repayment, right? That seems highly unlikely. So there's a lot of information out there that would lead you to believe that you should be terrified of using these plans, but the reality is there's a lot of protection baked into these master promissory notes. The rules are written and they're very well explained, and the government's going to have to honor this, right? So this is, I take some comfort in knowing that, as much as I've read these documents, I see it very unlikely that they can change this for folks who are in the middle of repayment. So one of the other questions and one of the last ones we want to cover here in relation to income-driven repayment is how does working part-time affect student loan repayment, right? And that's one of the great things. I kind of refer to these federal student loans and particularly the income-driven repayment options as insurance. And that's really what it is, right? You have this huge dollar amount that you have to manage through repayment, that if you base it on your income, well, if your income goes up, you're going to pay more. If your income goes down, so let's say you're working part-time or you're taking maternity leave or whatever the case is, if you're earning less, you pay less, right? That's how the programs work. You're not going to find that kind of flexibility in almost any other loan that you have, right? So if you bought for my mortgage, right, I don't have the ability to say, hey, Wells Fargo, I don't have any income the next 3 months. Can you knock my payment down to zero for my house, right? That's not going to happen, right? But you can do that with your student loans because they have that kind of insurance baked in, right? So if you're paying more than 10% of your income, you're probably paying more than you need to. Right, so if you're making $100,000 as a veterinarian and you're going to go to part-time and now you're going to be making $50,000 or $60,000 a year, you can have your payment cut in half, if not more, right? So 10% of your income, if your current student loan payment is roughly, if it's more than that, then you're probably paying more than you need to. Investigate what your payment would be under one of these plans once you know which ones you qualify for, and then you can actually build some flexibility into your budget. So family details are going to play a huge role there. If you're married, you file your taxes jointly, you're going to have to include your spouse's income. If you're using revised pay-as-you-earn, even if you file your taxes separately, they're still going to want to know what your spouse's income is. So there are some, pitfalls that you have to navigate. But again, that's where the Student Debt Center comes in. That's where we're able to help you answer some of those questions so you can formulate a plan that benefits you most financially. Deferment and forbearance. I got a great question via email before the session about someone who is approaching graduation and is considering an internship and wants to know whether or not they should defer or use income-driven repayment. Use income-driven repayment. Deferment and forbearance had their time. Income-driven repayment has really made deferment and forbearance obsolete, right? So one of the common occurrences that I actually see, in addition to internships, is something like maternity leave, right? So you live in a state where they don't have any kind of paid maternity leave option. You take 3 or 4 months off for maternity leave, and you don't have any income during that time. And they'll call up their loan servicer and they'll say, I don't have any income. Can you put me on deferment? And they'll grant you that deferment. However, the interest still accrues during that deferment. And then when you come out of that deferment, they take that interest and they add it to your principal. So when I told you before that your student loans don't compound, that's an instance where they do, right? And you want to avoid that. So if you use income-driven repayment instead, you can have your payment reduced because your income has reduced, and maybe even to zero, right? So you can have a minimum monthly payment of zero. If you're on unpaid maternity leave, they'll set your payment to zero for the next 12 months. Your interest will still accrue. However, when you come out of that income situation, that low or no income situation, your payment will go up, but they'll leave that interest where it was in that unpaid bucket where it's not accruing interest, right? And now you've saved yourself more money over the long run. You'll have less forgiven, right? So avoid that deferment and forbearance. It's tempting, particularly in academic settings, right? Because that's what everybody did when they did their internship and residencies. They deferred their loans. Don't do that, right? Get into income-driven repayment. You can probably get your payment to be zero, at least for the first year. And then if your payment is based on an internship or residency income of 30 or 35 grand a year, your minimum monthly payment is going to be almost nothing anyway, right? So better to keep that based on your income to prevent that interest from capitalizing than it is to use deferment or forbearance. Okay, any other questions on income-driven repayment?
Yeah, there was one good question. Will forgiveness negatively affect our future credit score and ability to get another loan?
So somebody needs to explain to me where that one's coming from. So that one came up during the AVMA Economics Summit, and I've had just a number of folks ask me that recently. So I wonder if that's being circulated somewhere. But the answer is no, right? And if anything, income-driven repayment is going to improve your creditworthiness, right? So when you're considered for a major purchase, for maybe a house, a car, a practice, whatever it is that you're looking for, they're going to look at your cash flow, right? And one of the items that's going to show up on your credit report is your monthly student loan payment. If that payment is significant, right? So more than 10% of your income, that's going to negatively impact your ability to obtain a loan for a major purchase. If you're using income-driven repayment, right, and it's at 10%, well, you have a lot more wiggle room to have some other monthly payments and still be looked at as a really good borrowing candidate, right? So that same thing happened when my wife and I purchased our home a few years back. You know, I was all ready to have an argument with the lending folks about how our student debt wasn't going to be able to allow us to borrow for the house, and it never even came up, right? Because they looked at our student loan payment amount as a percentage of our income on a monthly basis, and they didn't even ask us about the big number, right? So it can actually improve your ability to make major purchases. Now, when it comes to forgiveness, they don't consider that, right? And forgiveness itself, I've had some other people ask a question about, well, what about when forgiveness gets triggered? Is that going to trash my credit when it actually happens? And having debt canceled does not negatively affect your credit. Canceled debt exists in a variety of places. Now, generally, for you to have debt canceled, it means that you were not making payments on something for a period of time. That's not the case when it comes to student debt. You're actually considered to be in good standing by the Department of Education, even though you're making payments that are lower than the interest. So when that debt gets canceled, there is no reporting that to the credit agencies because you were never delinquent or you were never not making the payment. Now, if you don't make the payment to the IRS, that's definitely going to impact your credit. Right? So that's why you should be prepared for that. Use that 20, 25 years that you have to save for that anticipated tax on your student loans.
Yeah, and I've had similar questions on our Facebook group about students with new graduates with high debt that look to purchase a practice. And, you know, I've known of several that have done that, and the high loan balance has really not been a factor because, as you said, the banks really are more interested in cash flow. And I've had situations where people have bought a practice, and after they bought the practice, they said, well, now I'm earning more money as a practice owner. Should I now start paying off my loans, my student loans quicker, or should I pay off the loan for the practice? You know, my recommendation is always pay off the loan for the practice.
Yeah, and I think that in you know, hopefully, you know, one of the reasons you want to be a practice owner is so you're going to increase your income. And if you do increase your income, yeah, your payment on your student loans are going to go up too, but it can still be a percentage of your income, right? And I think that that's a good way to handle that, right? I mean, so either whether you use your additional income to pay down the the mortgage on the practice or your student debt, or you use that as an opportunity to look at buying another practice or maximizing your retirement further. I mean, there's probably 100 other things that I would put additional income towards before I got to paying extra or more than I have to on my student debt, or maybe even my practice loan, depending on what the interest rate was. So yeah, I mean, I think that you just have a lot more flexibility there.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great. Let's move on to a lot of questions about consolidating loans versus private refinancing of loans. You know, what are the pros and cons of consolidation versus private refinancing, and when would you recommend one and the other?
Yeah, so those are also very common questions that come up, and in this context, I just want to make the distinction. So when we talk about consolidation, I'm usually referring to a federal consolidation loan, and then when I refer to a refinance, it's usually taking your federal student loans and refinancing that with a private loan. Right, so I call those private refinance, and the federal consolidation is just basically taking all of your federal student loans and lumping them into a new federal student loan. Right, you can still call a private refinance a consolidation as well, right? Because you're maybe taking a whole bunch of student loans and consolidating them together. It just happens to be with a private lender, right? So, but the distinction here is when I talk about consolidation in the student loan context, it's usually in reference to a federal consolidation loan, right? And then when we talk about taking loans out of the federal system and putting them into a private loan, I refer to that as a private refinance. So, and there are instances where those things are extremely beneficial. So, federal direct consolidation loan. This is what I'm talking about for the student loans, mostly the student loans that you use for veterinary school and maybe the student loans that you have for undergrad. You can take them because you end up accumulating dozens of loans, right, through veterinary school. You can take all of that messiness and compile them into a single loan called a federal direct consolidation loan. You could do that at studentloans.gov. Now, why would you want to do that, right? So there are a number of reasons to do that. I alluded to one of them where it's messy, right? So maybe you had some loans that were not direct type loans. So if you borrowed before July 2010, there was a different loan type available then, the Family Federal Education Loan. So the FEL loan was available prior to July 1st, 2010. Those don't necessarily qualify for pay-as-you-earn and revised pay-as-you-earn. The direct consolidation loan is an opportunity to take those and put them into a loan that does qualify for those. If you have Perkins loans or health profession student loans, those are loans that don't qualify for income-driven repayment. The federal direct consolidation loan is going to allow you to pool those together and also qualify for the income-driven repayment plans. I really encourage folks that are in vet school to use a direct consolidation loan immediately after they graduate vet school. Right, and the reason for that is that it can help them end their grace period. And we actually did a webinar on this in June during the graduation season, and that's the link for it there. We'll provide this presentation link for you guys so you can click on those links too. But we went into excruciating detail on why you should graduate, consolidate, and get into income-driven repayment. And that's usually because for most veterinarians or veterinary students, they're going to graduate and their debt to income ratio is going to be above 1, right? So you at that point is a great time to get that minimum monthly payment as low as it possibly can for the first 12 months after you graduated, just to get your feet wet, right? And start to look at your budget, see where you have room, see where you have needs, and then you'll have that $0 monthly payment. You can actually extend that grace period out for a full year if you use a consolidation loan to end that grace period, right? So it's a little bit more confusing for those folks who are just graduating, but watch that video, read that blog post that we did on that. That's going to clear that up for you. But the timing is really crucial there. The other time this is appropriate is when you might have some loans that you want to qualify for revised pay-as-you-earn or pay-as-you-earn or even public service loan forgiveness. So one of the kickers with public service loan forgiveness is that it's only available for direct loans, right? So if you've got those health profession student loans, Perkins loans, older FEL loans, That's what's causing the problem, right? People have been making payments on those types of loans for a number of years, thinking they were doing all the right things, and then they come to find out, well, that loan type is not eligible for public service loan forgiveness, right? So if you're going to do something like that, consolidate your loans as soon as possible so you can have the most balance qualify for something like public service loan forgiveness or these more beneficial income-driven repayment plans, right? So and that, again, that's where the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool is going to help you wade through that, right? So it'll tell you which pieces of your balance qualify for the particular repayment plans, and we'll even break it down by direct, FEL, and Perkins loans for you. That's when that consolidation, you're not really going to save any money on the interest rate. You know, the interest that you have on 18 loans, if they're all direct loans already, is going to be basically the same as if you consolidate them and make them 1 or 2 loans, right? So you're not going to really get any interest rate benefit out of consolidating. The benefit really comes in being able to get access to income-driven repayment plans that you otherwise didn't have access to, and then particularly public service loan forgiveness. One of the other kind of side benefits, and one of the other reasons why we encourage graduates to do this, is particularly if you have Navient as a loan servicer. You know, all of the loan servicers are pretty terrible, and I put them all on a spectrum of terrible, but Navient takes the cake, right? They are the worst of the worst when it comes to loan servicers. Consolidating your loans is the only way that you have of choosing your loan servicer. So while you're a student, and after you graduate, if you have Navient, then you can move your loans away from Navient. It's probably not worth it to move them away from Navient if you're already in repayment, because a consolidation loan will reset the clock on any of these plans that we're talking about, because you're physically issued a brand new loan when you consolidate. So if you had a few years of qualifying towards, let's say, pay-as-you-earn forgiveness, if you consolidate, you're going to lose that time because it actually erases those loans and replaces it with a new one. The private refinance. So should I refinance to a private loan to lower my interest rate? Probably the most common question that comes up. I mean, you guys are probably getting bombarded with offers. I know I do on a pretty much daily basis in the mailbox from SoFi, DRB, College Ave, you know, whatever the new company is that's flashing fancy rates at you today, tomorrow, and the next day. And what are the downsides of private refinancing? So, you know, these are, again, common questions. So when it can work, I see some folks who have private student loans from undergrad, right? There are limits on undergraduate loans. If you've exhausted all of those and you went to an expensive undergraduate, you might have private student loans. When you take those out, unless they're also in your parents' name, those are usually not at a very favorable interest rate, right? So I see ones that are at 12, 19, 20% sometimes. Refinancing those now is a great idea, right? So you can get some great interest rates on private student loans if you're refinancing less beneficial private student loans, right? That's a good opportunity to do that. If your debt to income ratio is 1 or less than 1, and you're reasonably certain it's going to remain there for the duration of repayment, that's another good time where you might investigate a private refinance of your federal student loans, right? So that debt to income ratio 1, that's where those traditional repayment plans work best, because that's really what a private loan refinance is. It's a traditional repayment plan. You're going to refinance that loan. They're going to make you pay that loan back based on the balance and the interest rate over the next 7, 10, 12, 15 years, right? And that payment is going to largely be the same for the duration there. In many cases, that's probably going to be a amount higher than what you would be paying under income-driven repayment on federal student loans, right? So now you have to be really careful about comparing, am I actually saving money by refinancing my student loans, my federal student loans, versus using income-driven repayment? It's not just about the interest rate, right? It's about the repayment terms, and there are no private refis that mimic income-driven repayment, mostly because they can't make the math work, right? So, you know, you might want to take advantage of that. And then use the student loan repayment simulator to compare those costs. So know what you're giving up. These private loan refinances, I mean, this is what they do. This is all they do, right? So you have to be able to negotiate the terms of that loan to be as favorable as possible. You're also giving up that insurance that I've been talking about, right? So if you do fall on hard times and your income decreases for any reason, that private lender is really not going to care. The most beneficial deferment provisions I've seen in those loans are maybe 3 months at a time or 3 months total, right? So that's not going to cut it if you have, a medical issue or you're changing jobs and it takes you a little bit of time to find a new job. Your loan could easily end up in delinquency or default because you can't make the payments. Under the federal system, if your income goes down, your payment goes down, it can even be zero and you're still considered to be in good standing. A lot of the refinances as well, they're going to want you to include a cosigner. Now somebody else is on the hook for your student loans should something happen to you, right? Or it just gets messy. Right? So I would really discourage anybody from including a cosigner on a private loan refinance of a federal student loan. It's just not necessary. But that's something that you're going to have to be able to identify and then negotiate and see if that lender is willing to work with you on that. And then also, I see a lot of these private loan refinances that'll end up costing you more than if you just stuck with the income-driven repayment plans. You get the insurance that are with it. You get a lower monthly payment. Yeah, you have to navigate this whole forgiveness business potentially, depending on what your income does. But that can also decrease your total costs while keeping all of those benefits that we've been talking about. So just be really careful when you're looking at those and make sure that you're in the right position to be able to benefit from them. In the Student Debt Center, and I can go back to this and use our example that we've been illustrating from. So in the Student Debt Center and the Loan Repayment Simulator, we calculate what's called an effective interest rate, right? So we know from this person, again, this $464,000 starting balance, if they repaid based on the forgiveness amount $702,000, right? So they effectively paid $240,000 above what they started with over 23 years. That comes out to an effective interest rate of 2.33%, right? Even though the stated interest rate of this loan is 6.7, right? So that's the funny thing that income-driven repayment can do with forgiveness, because you're getting, in many cases, a significant discount through the tax. You end up paying much less in interest than you would if you paid the loan to zero under a traditional repayment plan, right? So this is the number that you want to use to compare against those fancy private refi offers that you're probably getting. There's not very many that are approaching that number, right? And oftentimes, and you can see here, if this person qualified for pay-as-you-earn or even revised pay-as-you-earn, we're looking at a negative interest rate in pay-as-you-earn and less than 1% under revised pay-as-you-earn, right? You're just not going to get a refinance at that kind of interest rate. So again, know what you're giving up, know how to compare the costs. You might find out that it's more beneficial to stick with federal student loan repayment program.
I think another point to make, especially with the private refinancing companies, is a lot of them don't have a lot of experience with veterinarians. And, we're in this kind of almost unique situation where we often have a very high debt load and an income that doesn't really service it. So although they're experts in refinancing, they may not actually know what the best thing is for you. So don't assume because they're a company with a flashy website or a slick sales pitch that they're actually going to really understand the situation you're in, because we found, I think Tony's found, sometimes the advice they give is really not good at all. And somebody asked, one of the questions they asked was, would you suggest getting a financial advisor? And I think that's always a good idea, but it's important that they kind of understand the situation we're in. And I think once you've gone through a program like the student debt simulation, you know what your monthly payment's going to be, you know what your monthly savings has to be for the tax bill at the end of that payment period. Having a financial advisor help you invest that tax savings money wisely is a great idea, but expecting them to understand the ins and outs of these income-driven repayment programs, sometimes they just don't know, and they may not tell you they don't know. And I had a situation with a friend that was signed up for one of these companies and was giving his associates really, I think, poor advice, poor financial advice, because they didn't really understand, the whole financial situation the veterinarian was in.
Yeah, and I think that it brings up a good point, because one of the more common questions I get is, just tell me who I need to find to help me figure this out, right? And unfortunately, there is not one person that can do that, right? But you can use a variety of professionals and yourself to come up with a really good plan, right? And the financial planners, and unfortunately, they're just not there yet. There are a select few that I trust in this regard, but even then, you have to go to them with an idea of what your situation looks like, right? So you may need a tax professional to help you assess the consequences of filing your taxes jointly versus separately if you're married, particularly if you live in a community property state where that's a little bit more challenging. Those are things that tax professionals are very good at, helping you understand the tax implications of that. Then you're going to want to run that situation against the student loan repayment simulator to see what that's going to do to your loan repayment costs, right? Then you can make the decision with your tax accountant, hey, I know it may cost me a couple of $1,000s more to file my taxes separately, but I'm going to save $5,000 in my loan repayment costs this year, right? So in that instance, you're going to have to tell your accountant, look, I know it may not make sense to you to file my taxes separately, but I'm going to save a lot more money on my student loan repayment plan if I do it that way. Then once I get down to my forgiveness plan, I can't go to the financial planner and just drop my federal student loan statements on his desk and say, hey, help me with this, right? You're going to have to run the simulation. You're going to have to see which repayment plan you're using and which one makes the most sense, and know that, hey, I need $184,000 23 years from now to cover this tax. That's the number that you can go to a financial planner with and say, hey, can you help me meet this goal? Right? That's what they excel at, right? So if they know how much money you have to work with each month and the target that you're trying to reach and when you're trying to reach it, they can help you craft a plan that's going to get you there, right? And in a variety of risk profiles to meet your investment comfort level, that's what they're going to be good at, right? So you're going to have to use tools like this to piece all of those professionals together and then ultimately make those decisions yourself.
Yeah, see, there are some questions that are kind of specific for people's specific situations, and I would recommend for those people visiting the Student Debt Center. We don't have time to go through every single specific question. There are a couple of general questions that I think I'd like Tony to address here.
Yeah.
So should I start paying my loans through school or start saving that money to pay taxes on forgiveness?
Yeah, great question. So students. So if you haven't heard me say it already, don't pay your student loans while you're in school, right? Borrow less. So where is the money coming from to pay your student loans while you're in school? If it's from a different student loan, you're really not gaining any ground, right? So the interest will accrue while you're in school on the loans that you take, right? So if you take less loan, you will accrue less interest and you'll ultimately pay less in total, right? So if you have the ability to borrow less, then do that first, right? So if you have some amount allocated to paying your student loans while you're in school, decrease the amount that you're going to borrow instead of paying on the student loans that you've already taken out, right? Because you're not going to gain any ground by borrowing money and then paying the student loans, paying the interest on the student loans with more borrowed money, right? So borrow less, you'll pay less in the long run.
Okay, two final questions before we move on to the last section. Do the income-based plans take production into account? If you're a production-based pay employee, the production is that included in the income calculation for the debt repayment program?
Yeah, great question. It depends. So it depends on when you are documenting your income and what income documentation you have available. So there are two ways for you to document your income under income-driven repayment. One of them, kind of the gold standard, the one they will always use, is your adjusted gross income from your tax return. It has to be from a recent tax return, right? So it can't be any more than 2 years old. We haven't filed our taxes for 2018 yet, right? So if I was filing for income-driven repayment right now, I would be looking at my 2017 adjusted gross income. Then you have to decide, is that a reasonable representation of my current income situation, right? So there's a question on the application that actually says, has your income significantly changed since you filed that recent tax return? Well, what does that mean, right? Significantly. So if it's not that different, then go ahead and use that, because it's going to be really easy if you apply through studentloans.gov and you pull your adjusted gross income directly from that tax return. There's an electronic way to do that. You don't even have to get your loan servicer involved. The Department of Education does it for you, and there's less mistakes that are made. However, if you're kind of in between, or maybe you've got a tax return that has half your school year on it and it says $30,000 and you're making $90,000 now, well, now your income is probably significantly different. So in that case, you're going to have to provide a pay stub. And the pay stub can be no more than 90 days old. So if I'm paid on production, I'm going to look for the most reasonable representation of my income during that 90-day window, right? That's probably not going to be the highest. It's probably not going to be the lowest. It's going to be something that represents an average month for me, because I don't want to have my student loan payment based on my most productive month ever, because it's probably going to be higher than I want it to be. So you're going to have to be a little bit, I guess, artful in which one you choose, and then you also have to be able to be comfortable with answering that question, has my income significantly changed, right? So you can either use your tax return, or you can use a pay stub that's no more than 90 days old. Use the one that's the most reasonable and is going to be the most beneficial for you. But one other point I will make on there is, usually when you use a pay stub, your loan servicer is going to kind of want to use your gross income. Take into account any pre-tax items that are on your pay stub, right? So if you're contributing to a 401k, or there's a health insurance premium or HSA payment that you're making, then you can deduct that from your gross pay, because that's non-taxable income. You may have to do that math for you, or for them, and then you're going to also want to indicate how often you're paid, right? So that's where I see a lot of the mistakes made, is the loan servicers, they don't know anything about your pay situation, right? And nor should they. They just take your pay stub and they start to make assumptions. So if you do most of the work for them, they'll generally accept it, because they don't like doing work on their own anyway, right? So use your knowledge of the plans and what we're covering tonight to come up with a estimated gross taxable income based on those pay stubs, and they'll base that payment off of that.
Excellent. So the final part of our discussion tonight, I want to talk about stress. And I hope that what Tony has said over the past hour and a half has helped to alleviate a lot of the stress that many young new graduates face when they see this mountain of debt, and they wonder, how on earth can we possibly manage this debt? I think that I hear from a lot of new graduates that feel like they're going to be a burden to the rest of their family, because they're not going to be able to pull their weight. And I hope that we've started to answer some of those questions and alleviate some of that stress. But I know it's something that commonly comes across on the Facebook groups, that it's hard enough starting out your profession, starting to figure out how to be a veterinarian, having this looming debt over your head is just something that just, in some cases, just feels like it's a crushing burden. I hope we've helped to make you understand that for the vast majority of people, that's not the case at all. There is a way to manage this. But Tony, if you could just maybe speak a little bit to the stress side of things.
Absolutely. So, and usually a lot of the time that after we do these things, it is, once you start to, that knowledge is power, right? And a lot of it is, unfortunately, some of those pressures that we feel come from some of the folks that we trust the most, right? So our parents, our first mentors in veterinary medicine, and I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of those folks, they just didn't have access to this way of repaying. So it's even more difficult for them to wrap their heads around, right? So they're going to encourage you to pay your debt off as fast as possible. And that can add even more stress because now you feel like you don't have any room in your budget and you're not gaining any ground. And, how can this be where you ended up? And it doesn't have to be that way, right? And one of the things we do know, Merck did a study this past year that they released, and the overwhelming stress that veterinarians said that they were feeling had to do with high student debt levels. And when I see this stresses me out, right? Because I feel like if more folks knew about income-driven repayment and knew how to use it and navigate it, that stress can drop way down, right? Because that you can remove those barriers, to at least those financial barriers that we might feel because of our student debt, but they don't necessarily have to be there. There's a way to handle this student debt that is different from any other debt that you may have experienced or any other debt that your parents or your mentors may experience, right? So there's different ways to handle this. Again, Student Debt Center, I've showed you guys where those tools exist so you can make sense of the numbers. This is just like a complicated medical case, right? And everybody here has been well trained and knows how to diagnose and treat complex medical cases. Student debt they're just numbers, right? So we can break this down and pick the repayment strategy that's going to reduce our financial stress to the lowest level possible. Right? And you can do that no matter what the number is, right? So will I be a burden to my family because of my high student debt? You certainly don't have to be, right? You have the ability to pay based on your income, right? But one of the things I see, once you start paying using income-driven repayment, or just because watching your balance grow is extremely stressful, it results in something that I have started calling traumatic statement syndrome, or TSS. Right? I figured if we gave it a medical-sounding acronym, maybe we can treat it. But it's acknowledging that, right? It's knowing that, hey, if I do this income-driven repayment plan and I have my payment based on my income, I know that there's a potential for my payment to not even cover the interest. So it's not reasonable for me to expect my balance to go down, right? So once I start to wrap my head around that fact that, hey, it's normal for this balance to increase based on the student debt that I'm carrying and the income that I'm currently earning, right? But that's okay because now I understand how this forgiveness plan works, right? I just have to be prepared for it, right? So I can start to analyze these things. I can start to break them down. I can, start to treat these things like a medical case and put together a treatment plan for addressing it. So first thing is doing that physical exam, right? So assessing your situation, locating your federal student loan file, your NSLDS file, download that, upload it into the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. You'll know which repayment plans that you have access to use, or whether or not you need to consolidate your student loans sooner rather than later. Then you can send that information over to the repayment simulator. Start to look at the numbers that are going to come out based on your situation, right? So you know your situation best, whether you're going to go on and do an internship, a residency, or maybe you're going to get married and start a family and have a couple of kids that are going to impact your income. I mean, all of those things are imminently doable. You want to buy a practice within 5 years after graduating. All of these things are doable no matter what your student loan repayment situation is, as long as you treat your student debt appropriately. I also want to encourage you to think beyond student debt. So one of the things I alluded to earlier was this big number that we can't seem to get around because it is probably the biggest debt that we've taken on at that point in our lives. But you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So one of the ways that I treat the traumatic statement syndrome that my wife and I experienced with our student debt, because our balance has grown since we graduated, is we build an emergency fund, right? So we don't have to rely on credit card debt. We can weather any blips in our monthly cash flow. We're maxing out our retirement plans and we're watching that grow over time. We bought a home, right? My wife is able to, pursue the career ambitions that she has as well as I do, right? Our student debt is not preventing us from doing anything, right? So the only things that we have to make sure that we take into account are that forgiveness plan. So I know that we're likely going to hit student loan forgiveness, and we're going to have to pay tax on that, right? So I'm also planning accordingly so we can be prepared when that happens. And I'm not wondering why I received a 1099-C in the mail from the IRS, right? These are all things that we can be prepared for. We have ample time to prepare for them. And if we start taking baby steps to reaching those goals, it will happen, right? And it does. The hardest part is getting started. You will get better at this every time you renew your income documentation. It becomes easier each time you do it. It's just like filing your taxes, right? You have to do that every year, right? It's just part of being a citizen. With our student debt balances, this is part of that program as well, right? You're just going to have to be one of those things that you do at least once a year in order to thrive financially. But it is doable, right? It's very, very doable. Just start breaking it down, just like a complex medical case. Come up with a treatment plan once you have all the options on the table. Is there some reassurance that there is a way out from under student debt? Absolutely, right? And I hope that if nothing else, you've taken that away tonight, right? I get a lot of interesting questions, particularly from students like, I don't want to be in repayment for the rest of my life, or, I feel like I'm going to retire with my student debt. Probably not, right? So for most of us, we graduate, the average age, right? So back to that the average age of a graduating veterinary student is like 28, right? So if you're in repayment for 20, 25 years, your debt balance will be zero, right? Either be zero because your income allows it to be zero, or you'll reach student loan forgiveness and it'll be zeroed out when you get that 1099-C in the mail 20 or 25 years after you start repaying, right? It has a definite endpoint. You will not be in student debt repayment forever. It will just depend on your circumstances whether you zero it out sooner rather than later. But either way, you will hit loan balance zero, and neither one is better or worse than the other. It's just going to be the plan that helps you get there when your situation allows it to happen. So, and I've already said this, your student debt doesn't have to prevent you from doing anything, right? So let your income determine your payment. If you're paying more than 10% of your income, just as a rough guide right now, you're probably paying more than you need to towards your student loans. Build that financial plan alongside your student loan repayment plan, right? Those are things that you can and should be doing at the same time. We've offered some suggestions for you to be able to do that, but that is definitely doable. And enjoy life, right? So, I talked to so many recent graduates who are, either planning to move back in with their parents, or, they're everything that they earn, they're taking all of their salary and living off their spouse's salary just so they can get to loan balance zero faster. Enjoy your life, right? We didn't go into veterinary medicine to pay our debt back, right? That's not the reason that we became veterinarians, right? It's just an ugly side effect of becoming veterinarians in the 21st century. So there are other ways to do this that allow you to have a life outside of paying back your student debt. So take advantage of those and ask questions if you're still not clear on how to do those. That's really what I had for you guys tonight. I'm happy to answer any more questions that you have in the session. We will make this stuff available for you so you can flip through it at your leisure and then also ask questions as they come up. But please feel free to take advantage of the time we have left here tonight to ask any additional questions that you have.
And I think a final comment I would make, to kind of follow through with the medical analogy, if you consider your student debt like maybe like a diabetic animal.
Yeah.
It's something that if you ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist, it's gonna blow up on you.
Yeah.
But with careful management and good advice from people that are knowledgeable and regular reevaluation of your patient, there's no reason why that diabetic dog can't live a completely normal lifespan. And I think that's the key. It's you shouldn't be afraid of your debt. You should conquer it and manage it, and it's very, very doable. And I hope this is really just an introduction. People have asked specific questions. I would encourage you to reach out to us. You can reach me on the Facebook groups under the Microscope. You can reach Tony at VIN. We can certainly try and help you. with specific questions, and maybe we'll do a follow-up, go into some of the follow-up questions we have. Maybe we'll do a follow-up webinar and try and cover things that people still have questions about. So I don't know if you want to look at some of the questions, Tony.
I am, yeah. I'm kind of scanning through some of them now. And so one I see for revised pay-as-you-earn public service loan forgiveness, do I need to have my loan serviced by FedLoan, my FedLoan, so FedLoan servicing? And that technically is the case, yes. So if you're working towards public service loan forgiveness, one of the things I would encourage you to do immediately is submit a public service loan forgiveness employment certification form, right? So this is kind of, after there was so many complaints by borrowers that are like, my loan servicer can't tell me if this qualifies or doesn't qualify. They came up with a form to help you determine that, right? As soon as you submit that form, and if they determine that what you're doing is eligible for public service loan forgiveness, they will move your loans over to FedLoan servicing, right? They are kind of the official servicer of the public service loan forgiveness plan. So yes, if you're working towards public service loan forgiveness and you don't have FedLoan servicing, then that should raise an eyebrow, right? Because that means you probably didn't submit an employment certification form, or if you did, they didn't think that what you were doing qualified for public service loan forgiveness. So make sure that you're submitting those forms, that your loans did get moved over to FedLoan servicing, and then continue to submit those forms every year when you renew your income documentation to make sure that you and the Department of Education are on the same page. So that's a good one. It's just kind of a technicality. I generally, so FedLoan servicing in that regard is usually the least terrible of the loan servicers, just because they have that responsibility of being the public service loan forgiveness monitor, right? So they tend to be more familiar with this than any of the other ones.
I just want to mention there is a group that's part of the VIN Foundation called Vets for Vets. And the purpose of this group is to help veterinarians that are struggling, more emotionally. If you have a lot of worries about debt, you have a lot of worries about practice, you're having some personal issues, and you feel like there's no one to reach out to, the VIN Foundation does have a resource called Vets for Vets, which is great. You'll receive a reply usually within a day or two from someone that can really help you, put you in touch with people that can help you through some of the difficulties that you're having. It's run by Dr. Bree Montana. It's a fantastic group, and I would encourage anybody who's feeling overwhelmed for whatever reason and need to talk to somebody who really understands a lot of the stresses that we're under, to go to the VIN Foundation, click on Vets for Vets, and we'll be more than happy to help you work through whatever issues you're having.
Absolutely, and I know that, and some of that, there's some overlap, right? So I know that I get some recommendations from Bree for those folks, because inevitably student debt is part of those stresses that are pushing those people into that distress. So if there's anything we can do to alleviate at least that part of your distress, don't feel free to reach out. Right? We want to get you answers sooner rather than later, so we can get you on the right path. There is also a really good question here, and one that I received via email before the session. Is there a certain type of investment or bank account that you recommend we put money away that would be used to pay for that final tax bill? Yeah, and that we could probably do another hour and a half session on that. But for the quick and dirty answer to that is get started, right? So go to a resource like bankrate.com or NerdWallet, and they compile a list of all of the highest earning savings accounts that are currently out there. Most of them are online savings accounts, but you want to get in the habit of transferring a certain amount from your checking account into one of those high interest money market or savings accounts first, right? So there's some that are out there that are earning close to 3% right now. So you can do that just to get started, start to build up a little bit of funds there. And then at that point, you're either going to decide that you need some help investing, right? And that's where that certified financial planner can maybe help assist you in that regard, and then give you an idea of where to put that money next. Or depending on your comfort level with investing, it's never been easier to do that on your own. I'm a huge fan of these robo-advisors that are out there, but I know that they're not for everybody. There's a lot of the major brokerage firms like Vanguard and Charles Schwab and some of the other ones that help you invest in index funds that are extremely low cost. That's a little bit like retirement investing, though. So you're going to subject yourself to a little bit higher risk. You have to be comfortable with something like that. But get started, right? So first, get started. Put some money in those savings accounts. If you want to wade into something that might increase your return, you can either do that on your own if you're comfortable, or with the assistance of a financial planner if you're not, right? So those are what I would recommend. And then as you're getting closer to the date that you anticipate having to pay that tax, you want to make sure that you're not exposed to anything that could potentially decrease in value suddenly, right? So you're not going to want to be exposed to the stock market in the year that you're going to pay the tax on forgiveness. So, there's going to be some information we're going to need to cover, but thankfully, nobody's really going to be facing student loan forgiveness, the taxable version, in any appreciable number until the year 2032, right? So we've got some years to come up with some strategies for that. But again, just get started. Start with those savings accounts first, and then if you want to wade beyond that, visit with a financial professional or start to investigate other areas of investing and read up on that so you're more comfortable with what you're getting into. Looks like I caused a little confusion on public service loan forgiveness. Do I first do federal direct consolidation, then do the public service loan forgiveness employment certification after? So yes, before you submit the employment certification form, you're going to need to be in repayment, right? So there's three things that determine your public service loan forgiveness eligibility. Your loan type, right? So it has to be a direct loan. Your repayment plan, right? So that implies that you have to be in repayment, and you have to be using one of those income-driven repayment plans, right? So you're going to have already been in repayment on your direct loans using one of the income-driven repayment plans. And then the third part of that is you have to be working for a qualifying employer, right? So either a government, state, tribal agency, or one of those 501c3s. Those folks are going to have to fill out part of that form as well. So you're going to have that job, right? So you're going to have to be in that job, and then they're going to have to fill out that form indicating that you're an employee. And then if you're doing the other things correctly, they will move your loans over to Fed Loan Servicing, and you will start to get credit for that public service loan forgiveness, those payments that you're making. I think we've covered a lot of these. Any other ones jumping out to you, Carl?
No, I think we've covered most of this. We have saved all the questions, and we will go over them after the seminar. If there's something that pops up, like I say, we may consider doing a second webinar to answer some of the questions that have been raised tonight. And like I say, please feel free to reach out and ask if there's something that you didn't really understand, or maybe you need explaining in a different way. And we'll certainly do our best to accommodate that. But I think for now, I really thank everybody for attending. I know it's hard to get spare time when you're a veterinarian, and I appreciate you spending that time with us. A big thanks to Jordan Benshea, the Executive Director of the VIN Foundation, who's been instrumental in helping to do this, and obviously a huge thanks to Tony Bartels. I can't imagine the complexity of dealing with loans without having somebody like him to help me navigate through it. He helped me, say, with my son's loans. He's an incredible resource, and he's always very generous with his time helping people. So a huge thank you to Tony and everything that you do for the profession. I think we'll wrap up now, and like I say, we will hopefully once this has been recorded and edited, we will post it so people can watch it again. And hopefully, if there's a demand, we can do more of these in the future.
Yeah, no, thank you, Carl, for bringing this to us. This was fun, and I think it helps us kind of expand out beyond some of the stuff that we do directly with the schools and through the through the various conferences and things. So I know that there's lots of questions that originate on social media, and you don't always get to see some of the answers in some of these conversations we've had. So it was fun to kind of to do that in conjunction with some of the groups and where those questions come from. So I look forward to do that in the future.
Excellent. Well, good night, everybody, and thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you.